Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the 10 most emotionally draining concertos. Yes, I said the emotional drainage episodes were done, but then some of you said, well, of course, you really didn't do concertos, and concertos are hard to do because they tend to have a happier aspect, being virtuoso pieces for a soloist, so it's understandable. Well, how could I take that lying down, right? I had to do concertos, so here they are. And you're right, you're absolutely right. Concertos are a little bit more difficult to ferret out because they do tend to be, happy vehicles for jolly virtuosi, even if those jolly virtuosi are miserable human beings in real life. The music that they play tends to be kind of perky, or if it starts in a minatory minor key, which is where I guess the word minatory comes from, doesn't it? In a more distressing key or a more turbulent key, or they touch on deeper emotions, they tend to, clear up towards the end. The clouds part, the sun comes out, everybody's happy. Well, not always. Or even if the ending is happy, there can be quite an emotional roller coaster along the way. There's room for drainage, no matter what the solo instrument is. And so here is my proposal for the 10 top emotionally draining concertos. And actually, I'm going to be mentioning more than that because there's more than that. There's so much out there, folks. There really is. And we could have such a good time talking about it. So let's begin. This first one is yours. This was absolutely your suggestion. And you were right. You were right. It could have been in any of these other talks that were appropriate for orchestral works, the Berg Violin Concerto. It's unquestionably one of the most emotionally draining pieces out there in any form. It happens to be a violin concerto. And it's kind of, I guess, the model for concerto drainage generally. I mean, it's the first thing that's going to come to mind, I think, for most people. And it is, of course, a tone poem about the death and suffering of Manon Gropius, who died of meningitis. She was the daughter of Walter Gropius and Alma Mahler Gropius, Werfel, Kokoschka, whatever else, And so there was it's not a happy piece. But aside from happiness and sadness, those sort of generic moods, it goes through every conceivable expressive range. It does everything. It's happy, it's sad, it's ultimately tragic. It's an amazing piece. When the Bach chorale Es ist genug comes in at the end, after that horrifying climax, and then this beautiful adagio just engulfs the violin. I mean, it's some of the most expressively intense and deep and beautiful and profound music in the entire orchestral literature. So yes, concerti can feature extra super duper drainage, and the Berg Violin Concerto is the classic example, the iconic example. And so I think that's the perfect piece to lead off this list. Second, the Walton Viola Concerto. This is another piece that some of you have mentioned. It's a masterpiece. Everybody agrees it's a masterpiece. It has, that most terrible of concerto habits of ending quietly. That's probably why it's not played as often as it should be. It has a slow, fast, slow form. It uses the viola, which is the string bearer of melancholy, one of those emotionally ambivalent instruments. And it really actually seemed to be a specialty of the English school writing works for solo viola and orchestra. Beautiful, beautiful works. And there are quite a few of them. But the Walton, of course, is the iconic 20th century example, and it was the piece that really put Walton on the map. It's a deliciously melancholy, bittersweet, and tender piece of music with a very brilliant central movement. But the overall impression that it gives is one of profound meditation and thus superior drainage. It's definitely an extremely moving piece of music. And, I suppose when we talk about concerto drainage, what we mean is that the emotional expression is more important than the virtuoso aspect. I mean, that's really how you can tell what's going down with a concerto. There's an overall emotional trajectory that the music is going to express, and it's going to do it with the aid of a soloist. But the fact that there is a soloist does not overwhelm all of the other expressive intentions of the music. And I think that's where we're going with this group. So number 2 is the Walton Viola Concerto. Next, the Busoni Piano Concerto. How can we leave that out? 5 jumbo movements. It's like more than an hour long. It has a male chorus in it. I mean, it's got a vocal bit, and there happens to be a piano along for the ride. And that piano part is really a bear. It's extraordinarily difficult. It's Busoni's orchestral masterpiece. And Busoni was not a great orchestral composer, generally speaking. He didn't write a lot of orchestral music, and he didn't write a lot of really interesting orchestral music. His scoring tends to be somewhat gray and monochrome. I'm not quite sure what was going down there. But in the piano concerto, he just pulled himself together, and it's his musical testament, a work of enormous fire and passion, and ultimately sort of elegiac, however we pronounce that word, of elegiac intensity. Extraordinary piece. It's kind of it's a legendary work among pianists. And let's face it, piano concerti specifically are much harder to provide drainage than string concerti, because cellos, violins, violas, they're the more vocal instruments, the more singing instruments. They're also the instruments that are easier because they're weaker to integrate into an overall orchestral path or program. Whereas the piano, it's got to be a virtuoso solo instrument. It has to be. And it has to have its own independent identity against that of the orchestra. And if you don't do that, then the piece may be incredibly draining expressively, but it's going to be a total failure as a piano concerto. And in order to have both, there has to be this constant tension between what the soloist is doing and what everyone else is doing and where they're collectively going. And the Busoni Piano Concerto manages that. It's a great work that you really ought to hear, but not one for, as you might, gramophone would say, not one for casual, everyday listening. You need to feel the need for drainage when you listen to the Busoni Piano Concerto. Number 4, here's another piano work that probably very few people know. Ernest Bloch's Concerto Symphonique for piano and orchestra. Now, this is basically a symphony for piano and orchestra in 3 big movements. A slowish opening with really great thematic material. It's an intensely cyclical work. Then a middle scherzo, and then a bravura finale. And that bravura finale is sort of the sticking point because it's really fun. But I would say, there are no great performances of this work that have been recorded. There really aren't. There was an old one on Vanguard that was, so-so. And then came one on Laurel Records. Remember Laurel Records? That was Herschel Burke Gilbert's label. And it featured a young Asian violinist who was okay. She wasn't great. It had the best orchestral accompaniment. And then Jenny Lind did one for Hensler, which was fabulous in the first 2 movements. But the conductor, it was his fault. The conductor took the finale just too slowly. It's not intolerable, but it should just have more oomph than that finale does in that performance. There's one on Chandos that was just not good. I mean, it was just all over mediocre. I think Valery Polyansky was the conductor. We badly need a great recording of the Concerto Symphonique because it is a masterpiece, a really powerful, intense, expressive piece of music. I mean, there is a flood of drainage going on in that work, but as of yet, it hasn't achieved its fullest expression, on disc anyway. I am hoping, I've been asking for decades, that BIS would do it, because they've been working very slowly through most of the Bloch orchestral music. But nothing yet, so who knows? Who knows when it's going to pop up? But I do hope somebody gets around to it, because it's a total, complete masterpiece of concerto drainage, and we need to hear it. Number 5, here's one that's going to surprise you. The Pulank Concerto for Organ, Strings, and Timpani. Now, Pulank is just not a composer you think of when you think of expressive intensity in some respects, although when we did vocal music, his opera, The Dialogues of the Carmelites, was way, way up on the list, because it's just a gut punch of a piece, an extraordinary piece. Pulank was more than capable of it, and actually, I think he's misjudged for that reason. You know, he's known for being sort of funny and facetious and wacky and all over the place. But what Poulenc had was the ability to he was a Janus-faced. He looked in both directions at once. He could move from crazy high spirits to Dadaist, insouciance and ridicule, to the deepest tragedy within 2 bars. I mean, because he wrote in like 2 and 4 bar phrases, and his music is collage-like, and depending on where he's drawing from, you never know what's going to happen next. Even his light and fluffy concertos, like the piano concerto or the concert champêtre, the 2 piano concerto, in those central movements, they just have a depth of expression. Sometimes it's cliched expression. Sometimes he's using other people's chords, as we used to say. I think, was it Poulenc who said there has to be room for music that uses great music that relies upon other people's chords, but it's knowing how and when to use them. And the organ concerto is a gripping piece of music. It's a big single movement, 25 minutes long, for organ, strings, and timpani. The opening is based on, it's obviously Bach. It's what the G minor toccata and fugue, or prelude and fugue in G minor, whatever it's called. And and then it moves on from there. But organ music can be very creepy and extremely, extremely imposing and impressive. And this is one of those concertos. It runs from metaphysical anguish to fairground calliope music, and back and forth and back and forth. And the ending is actually transcendentally expressive, and it has wonderful, wonderful moments of extraordinarily deep and meditative thought. He doesn't get the credit he deserves for being a serious composer, but he was, and he took himself very seriously indeed. And that concerto is one of the great 20th century essays in emotional drainage. There's no question about that for me. So that's number 5. Number 6, well, this one is sort of obvious. Mozart's Concerto number 24, the one in C minor. I remember the first time I heard it. First of all, it was the model for like every C minor concerto that came afterwards, like Beethoven's Third. The Mozart begins with that sort of da 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 dum dum ba da da do do do, which of course became Beethoven's da 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 dum 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 bum 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 bum, etc., etc. I mean, it's really an important work for what came later. But all by itself, did Mozart ever write a more ghostly, spooky, powerful piece of emotional expression than that concerto? Well, the other one, the D minor, is of course also a big deal. But this one stays spooky and creepy all the way to the end. The finale is a theme and variations, and I'll never forget the first time I saw it. It made such an impression on me. I remember the end of that movement particularly. It's like wind blowing over the graves. I mean, that there's no escape from C minor, that minor key, and that's Mozart's gift. He exploited what the musicologists call tonal economy. That means simply you just don't change key that often. one of the ways of achieving, that feeling of tragic intensity is just by landing on a minor key and sticking with it. And Mozart stuck with it. You know that if this is where you start, this is where you're going to wind up. And the C minor piano concerto is just a masterpiece that way. It also has a slow movement of such shatteringly beautiful innocence. Pulank actually stole it for the central movement of his double piano concerto. So, this very, very similar melodic idea, Mozart, for the Mozart 24th Concerto. But it's one of those pieces that is so just delicately pure and lyrical and heartfelt. And then when the minor key returns, you see it's the range. It's the range that does it. And Mozart has the range to achieve drainage in the 24th Piano Concerto. Really, I think, a very, very poignant piece of music and just incredibly gripping, extraordinarily gripping. After Mozart, well, now we're going to just go crazy for the rest of these. Yeah, let's just nail this thing to the post. Schnittke's First Cello Concerto, which is, it's like 50 minutes long. It was written, right after one of his multiple near-death experiences, but I think the first and the worst of them. And my God, gee whiz. I mean, it's the Berg Violin Concerto of cello concertos, let's put it that way. I mean, it is so unbelievably intense. And in the last movement, when this chorale comes in, it becomes this sort of liturgical music with bells and whatnot. And it's absolutely a person near death seeing the light. It's move towards the light. There it is. It just makes you perspire. It's an unbelievably draining experience, and one of the great expressive milestones in concertosity in the 20th century. There is no question about that in my mind, and it should make any short list of the most draining concertos, most draining anythings in 20th century orchestral music. It's just amazing. So Schnittke's First Cello Concerto. Next, well, here's one also that may surprise you. The Elgar Violin Concerto. I mean, what about that one? There's a violin concerto which is so much more than just a violin concerto. It has all of the virtuoso licks that a violin concerto has to have, but it is a huge, symphonic, expressively intense piece of music. It's about 50 minutes long. Again, the finale is absolutely extraordinary. There's that incredible central cadenza where Elgar invented, in effect, the pizzicato tremolo, where the rest of the strings just strum their instruments on different chords, while the violin itself simply muses on the themes of the concerto. It's the entire ensemble listens to the soloist in this completely inwardly directed, the German word is Innigkeit, that inner contemplation of its place in the universe. And if that is not a drainage episode, then I don't know what is. But the whole work is that way. It is so incomparably greater than the cello concerto, and which I just find to be pale and uninteresting. And the only reason it doesn't get the kind of attention that the cello concerto gets is that, well, Jacqueline Dupre was a cellist. That's the first reason. And the second is that it's a lot longer, much, much longer, which means, third, it requires patience. It requires a willingness to enter its special world. But if you really are serious about your drainage, you have to be willing to do that. You have to have the patience. You have to be willing to participate in the special emotional expression of the work. And the Elgar Violin Concerto is one of the absolute great pieces ever written for violin and orchestra. And I think that because it's so of itself, it doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. It's a special work. It's a work of drainage. So it definitely belongs in that category. Finally, well, we're not finally, we're almost done. We're at number 9. Number 9, this is another just, wow, what a just heartbreaker, intense piece. Martinu, his concerto for two-string orchestras, piano and timpani. Now it's Martinu. It's a concerto grosso type piece. You've got two-string orchestras. You've got a pianist in the middle. You've got a timpanist in the back. This was a wartime piece, and for some reason or a memory of wartime, but it's really, really gripping and anguished. It's quite similar in a way to, like the Bartók music for strings, percussion, and celesta. It has that kind of angst. The outer movements are incredibly turbulent and intense and driving rhythmically. It just keeps hitting you really, really hard. And the central movement, oh my goodness, I use it as a ringtone. And whenever it goes off, people run away screaming. It's that frightening. It's a terrifying movement, an extraordinary picture of horror and desolation. And, drainage doesn't all have to be horrible. I mean, we know that, right? It can be quite transfiguring, as at the end of the Schnittke cello concerto or moments in the Elgar, which ends happily after all. I mean, it's about range, like I said, and this piece has it too. It has range and intensity, and that's what makes it so powerful. Martinu is so often considered a somewhat facile composer, someone who wrote lots of music, and it's in a chirpy neoclassical style with lots of busy textures, and he did. I mean, he did that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's delightful music. Often it's simply just happy and bouncy and enjoyable. But here he is indulging in a dark night of the soul, and it is one extraordinary piece of music. It really is just unbelievably powerful. So the double concerto for two-string orchestra, piano, and timpani is one of the emotionally draining concerti. But the king of concerto drainage was Shostakovich. I mean, Shostakovich's music was Shostakovich's music. Didn't much matter what he was writing it for, did he? Did it? And there are at least three that I would add to the list of emotional drainage. I have to pick one, but three are, and let's just get them listed: the first violin concerto, the first cello concerto, and the second cello concerto. They are amazing. Now, the two cello concertos are incredible works, but I didn't list them here only because we have Schnittke's, which is sort of, the Shostakovich on steroids, number one. And number two, I've just mentioned them, so they're kind of sneakily in there anyway, so I can cheat a little bit. But my number 10 is the first violin concerto, because first of all, violin concertos are so difficult to write. I mean, they really are. I mean, the issues of balance and, they're virtually, you have to be a really great composer to successfully write a great violin concerto that is not just some sort of empty virtuoso vehicle for the violin. And there aren't many of them. Remember, we did our talk on romantic violin concertos, and there are only, a little handful of them, the great romantic violin concertos. Very, very few. You've got Mendelssohn, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Bruch, then Sibelius a little bit on the other side of the 20th century. That's your collection of romantic violin concertos, and most great composers only wrote one of them because the effort is simply so taxing, and you have to have a virtuoso who's willing to play it, and that you can't just sort of shove out a violin concerto and hope that it's going to take. It doesn't work that way. Shostakovich, of course, had David Oistrakh, who was willing to play whatever he wrote for violin and orchestra. And this concerto was a gift. It is the gift that keeps on giving in terms of drainage. My goodness. I mean, the opening nocturne is so spooky. And then you've got this bitter burlesque movement. And then this Passacaglia, which is one of the most noble creations for violin and orchestra. An extraordinary piece. And if you look at the score, which I recommend, by the way, if you look at the score, you see that all of this intensity of expression and breadth and melodic exaltation occurs with the most minimum orchestration, mostly just strings. It's an incredible piece. Then there's this epic cadenza, which is a movement all in itself. It's 4 or 5 minutes long, before the absolutely wacky finale, which is cyclical. All the themes from the concerto come back. It's a burlesque, and it makes fun of them. It mocks everything that we've heard so far on the way to an absolutely thrilling, feverish, crazy conclusion that doesn't have a single note out of place. It is just an incomparably fabulous achievement and a textbook case in concerto drainage. So that's the 10, and the list is down below. And I hope you've enjoyed this sort of appendix. Actually, there's one more appendix coming, which I'm not going to tell you about in detail. But I think that, we were having so much fun doing these. I couldn't resist tossing in just one more, and maybe one more after that. And then we'll have to draw the line, because, too much drainage creates a flood. And you don't want to have a mess on your bathroom floor, do you? So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.